that was an example of negative harmony. This is something I wanted to do a lesson series on for a while. I know that video had come out like a few years ago where Jacob Collier talked about it, and people were talking about it a lot after that. And I heard like a lot of people trying to make things, but I was hearing a lot of stuff that didn't sound right to me. So I started looking into it, and I actually discovered some pretty cool things about it that I think are crucial to how negative harmony actually functions. So this lesson is supposed to be, an advanced lesson, just a heads up. If you don't have a firm, like really, I would say, really extensive understanding of jazz theory, it's going to probably go over your head. So, but other than that, yeah, thanks for listening. All right, so I'm going to start talking about pitch spirals. A guy named Ernst Levy was a Swiss musicologist who wrote a book called A Theory of Harmony. And he talks about these. I mean, they date back to Bartók. They're things, they kind of generate new melodic content. So if you look at this pitch spiral, this is a unison spiral. This is not the one we're dealing with, but it's just an example. Top voice moves up a half step, bottom voice moves down a half step, so on and so forth. Ernst Levy was particularly interested in the fifth spiral because of what you call the reflection point of the notes. It generates a minor triad. I'll talk about that in a second. So the fifth spiral, C to G, it sounds like this. Okay, you get the idea. So the bottom voice moves up a half step, top voice down a half step until they pass each other, which is what we call the reflection point. These two right here. So if we look at a major chord, we know a major chord comes from the overtone series. That's why this fifth thing works so well. It's foundational to harmony. So we have a major third interval, C to E. We have a minor third on top. Now, if we take G, the fundamental note generated by C, and we go down a major third, down a minor third, which is the opposite of what we did to build the chord, we get a C minor chord. So that's pretty interesting. That's kind of like an explanation of where minor could come from. It's like it's the reflection of a major chord from the overtone, the first overtone, or the first harmonic, however you want to put it. So that is a pretty interesting way of looking at it. The cool thing is, as you see, these notes translate. So the C here on the bottom goes to the G here. The E, kind of in here, I know it's hard to see, goes to the E flat on top, or D sharp or whatever. G, once you get to G in the top voice, or the bottom voice, which passes to the top voice, it reflects. You get the idea. So this is what you use, this thing is what you use to translate the notes in the key of C. So if this isn't making sense, I think it will in a second. That's like the classical explanation of it. I'm going to go into the jazz explanation now, talk about the negative tritone. So obviously we understand that 5-1 is the foundation of what we call Western harmony. Meaning, the first overtone we hear other than the fundamental is a G. So if we're playing C, we hear the overtone G. That's the first different note we hear. So 5-1 is within nature. It's when you play a C, you're also hearing a 5. So that makes sense why you would hear that sound. And then eventually the scale came about. They started building chords in thirds, and we came up with a G7 chord that has a tritone in it. So that, with the F and B in there, resolving to the E and the C, that's like the foundation of everything Western harmony is built on. So the reason this negative harmony thing is so cool is because it takes that rule, forget about all the stuff with fundamentals, it takes that exact same voice leading and does everything backwards. So if your voice leading is exactly the same, it has to be legitimate because your ears are going to hear things resolving just from the opposite direction. I'll go into that again more. Okay, stay with me for a second if you're lost on this. When we talk about these tritones, right, we're talking about F and B going to C and E. So look at when I play it on guitar, look at how that looks. See how it's resolving downward? The motion of it resolves downward. To demonstrate it even further, let's cycle fifths, like 5/7 chords. So, right, D7 to G7 to C. Now let's just do the tritones. They're all resolving downward to get to C. But what happens if we flip it and here's our C, we go upward? The key thing here to understand is there's actually another tritone that resolves to a C major chord. So instead of resolving to C and E, we resolve the tritone to the notes E and G, the upper part of the C major triad. And that tritone is this. I'm sure you can already see it. It resolves in the opposite direction. It resolves from below and it resolves up. See? Whereas before we were resolving down. Now, same exact voice leading. I mean, if you want to make it the same, you would resolve to 1 minor. We'll talk about that too, but it's the same voice leading up until you get to the root. So what we have to do, what we've just done now, is we've flipped the motion that the harmonic resolution is going in. So that means for the bass, since we flipped the motion, instead of going from a fourth, resolving up a fourth, we have to resolve down a fourth, or up a fifth, actually, is the better way to think of it. So instead of resolving down a fifth, we have to resolve up a fifth, because we've just reversed the direction that the harmonic motion is going. So, F of the bass. And that is the basic idea of negative harmonies. The voice leading is exactly the same. I'll talk about that again in a second. Okay. And keep remembering equal and opposite is the key to understanding negative harmony. Everything in the positive has an opposite reaction. All right, now we go into the scale degrees. So this is the first thing I saw people weren't really getting right. When you do a scale, when you play a major scale, you think of solfege or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. If you're doing negative harmony though, you can do the same thing, but you have to start from the first note and you go down. So meaning you go, rather than go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's the opposite. And that's something I think will clear up a lot of these issues with negative harmony of chords not really working or kind of sounding right, but not 100%. That's the first thing. You have to understand the scale motion goes in the opposite direction. I drew out this chart here. You can ignore the bottom part of that for now. Just look at this top part. Actually, I'm going to go back to this file. So see how we have C, B flat, and we're building the exact same. We're doing the exact same scale as the major scale. We're just doing it in reverse, intervallically speaking. To get these, we're reflecting notes around what we call the pitch axis. So, and we get an E flat, we get an E flat major scale or a C minor. But really the way you want to think of it is, if you're going to think of it in terms of the 1, you want to think that it's counting down. So if you're wondering, just to back up a second, if you're wondering where the scale came from, it comes from reflecting all the notes of a C major scale around this axis, right? So C goes to G, D goes to F, E goes to E flat, so on and so forth. And we get this. So it's really like a G Phrygian. We're starting it from C though, because that's our root note. At least that's where we are headed. So you have to think about where you're going in this kind of thinking. So then if we start building chords off of that, we take C, E, G. Now that becomes G, C, E flat. Okay, then what if we take our second chord? We take D, F, A. Well, that is now going to become F, B flat, D. So you get the idea. So the first thing to think of is you want to think, I think if you need help visualizing this, you can visualize like a number line. So you know how in math you have positive numbers and you have negative numbers? It's like that. So here's, whatever, up here is like +1, +2. This is like -1. It's just an analogy, but think of a number line if you're having trouble visualizing it. Okay, so these chords are going to look like this. 1 is minor, 2 is major, 3 is major, 4 is minor, 5 is minor, 6 is major, 7 is still diminished. So right here, just from using these chords alone, this would give you, if you're like a pop songwriter and writing songs, just that alone, you could translate everything. So if you have a song that goes, let's say that really common chord progression, 1, 5, 6, 4, you could do a -1, -5, -6, -4, and just look at this chart. So you would go, let's see, -1, -5, -6, -4. So that sounds like pretty interesting. Already we have, just from that much, we already have a totally different perspective. Another thing that I want to point out here, and this is going to be a key part of understanding this negative harmony thing, is all of the roots are now in the bass. So we're going to talk about that here in a second. Chord extensions are now totally flipped, right? So because of the fact that we're starting this whole thing off of G, right? The C goes to the G when we flip it around. All of the functions of the extensions change. Okay, so now we get into the other part, which is understanding the chord tones and extensions. So this is a little tricky, so stick with me for a minute, but I'll try and explain it as clearly as possible. So let's just focus on the triad for now. So this is 1, 3, 5. It's just the reflection of a C major triad, right? So the C goes to the G, the E goes to E flat, and the G goes to C. What this basically means is that the 1 and 5 are flipping their functions. Now, this doesn't really matter for jazz purposes. It will matter later when we deal with altered chords, but for now, you can just think that it's the same chord triad, right? So it's a C major going to a C minor triad, or a C minor over G triad, really. Now, the interesting thing is when we start going to the 7, right? So we're going C, E, G, and now the next extension we'd have in our positive land, it would be a B, right? A C major 7. If we reflect the B, we get an A flat. Now the thing is, the A flat, that makes this confusing. Like some people were saying, oh, well, that means it's an A flat major 7. No, it's not. It's actually a C minor over G with a flat 6. Okay, so if that sounds confusing, I'll explain this a little bit more clearly. When we had our minor 6, I'm playing an F minor 6, going to 1. Well, why is it not F minor 7? Right? You would think if it's a G7 in positive, it would be an F minor 7 in negative. But what actually happens is because of this, because we're starting from the 5th and stacking down, because of that axis, the extensions stack on opposite. So that means that the 13 functions like a 7 would in positive harmony. So I'll say it one more time. The 13 or the 6 in negative harmony functions like a positive 7 would. That starts to make things pretty interesting for how we interpret negative harmony. Because now we have two weird things going on. We're counting the scale degrees backwards, right? We're counting do, re, mi, fa. And on top of that, all of the chord extensions and how we know them to be felt. And I'm talking in terms of feel, This 6 no longer feels like a 6. It feels and functions with the weight of a 7 in positive. So now that I've talked about the triad and a little bit about the seventh, or really the sixth, right? So we are saying that in negative, the sixth functions like a seven would in positive. I'm going to go over to the chord chart here I have here. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 notes of the major scale, right? We're doing it in 7 chords now, not just triads. So when we reflect a 1 chord or a C major 7, we would get C minor flat 6 over G. That's a negative 1. All right, pretty straightforward. That's pretty much what we've been talking about. A 2 chord is a little bit more interesting though. A D minor 7 goes to a B flat 6 over F. However, I put this double negative symbol here to indicate that the extensions are not what you think, right? So if we go back over to our chart here, remember that before we said the 7 is taking, or I'm sorry, the 6 is taking the function of the 7 would in positive. So if we look at here, we have a C minor chord laid out, right? So here is the 7, this B flat here. But remember, because the 13 or the A flat is functioning like the 7 would, now the 7 functions like the 13 would. So that means the extensions are going to be stacking on different here. This is not a B flat 6 major, it's a B flat 6 dominant. So just keep that in mind when you're playing this. The quality should be dominant, not major. That will sound, if you do add that dominant 7th, it's going to feel the way a positive D minor 13 would feel. And by the way, it's worth noting, the proof for all this is in the voice leading. So if you look at a 2-5-1, I just did this little thing here. The minor voice leading is exactly the same. It's identical. So that's how you know that it's valid that the 13 is functioning like the 7. Okay, so moving past the 2 chord, the 3 chord is E minor 7 in positive, and negative, the negative version of that is A flat 6. That's a normal 6, like a major 6 this time. So it's just back to normal over E flat. I just use this symbol. It's just a reminder. The double negative is like, just remember that the extensions are in the negative. So yeah, that's E minor 7 becomes A flat 6 over E flat. F major 7 becomes G minor with a flat 6 over D. Again, these roots right now don't make a difference. You could just say it's C minor flat 6 or G minor flat 6. But when we start getting into altered stuff, it will make a difference. So it's good to just kind of have that in the back of your mind. Okay, the 5-7 is G7. F minor 6 is the negative version. 6 is A minor 7. That translates to E flat 6. That's a major 6 over B flat. The diminished, or the 7, is B, or that translates to D diminished over A flat. Sometimes I'll write the double negative over the 7 as well, because it kind of sounds like a dominant chord, but it's important to remember that it's really still a diminished chord when you see it like this. Okay. So another thing I think is worth looking at is going back to our jazz movements, right? We were talking about 2-5-1s. Now let's take a 3-6-2-5-1, right? So all dominant. Now we're going to be going in the opposite direction. So instead of, we're going to be going, and the way to visualize that is by thinking like this. I made this chart just to show this. So if we're dealing with chords in the positive, they're resolving from above and they're resolving down, right? Almost as if you're jumping into the water. Here's the water. But from the negative, it's like you're swimming from beneath the surface underwater up, right? So it's just a visual to think. But that's how you want to be thinking about these, this negative versus positive. Is the positive is coming from above, landing down on the ground. The negative is coming from beneath, rising up. Same thing happens like if we are moving away from the root with another chord, you will move equally distant, right? Equal and opposite to that chord. So an E major 7 in the positive, when we flip it over the axis of C to G, is A flat minor flat 6. So it goes in the same amount we went away from C for the E major 7, it goes the same distance in the opposite direction. Something else that's cool, so the first example we'll see of this is using a Bach 4-part chorale. So I just took this excerpt from a Bach chorale. Here's the positive. Here's what it sounds like. Now here is the negative, and it's, again, the proof that this works is all of the voice leading, as far as I can tell, is pretty much exactly, I think it's exactly the same. Follows all of the rules and of part writing and all that 4-part harmony stuff. So here's what it sounds like. So I'll play them back to back now. So 2 bars of positive, 2 bars of negative. Pretty interesting. Again, it's pretty basic. You know, the 1 is now the negative 1. The 5/6 is now the negative 4/6. The 1 is now the negative 1. And by the way, 5/6, remember, Roman numerals, that just means first inversion. We're not talking about extensions here. Okay. So that's pretty much a good primer. If you understand all of that, you'll understand when we start getting into how to analyze songs, and really the important thing is how to not only play over pop songs or jazz standards to solo, but it's also, you can look at it as like a compositional tool. One more thing to note about the Bach chorale before we move on is that you'll notice it's negative 4 minor 6 of 4. So it's not 5/7 of 5, it's 4 minor 6 of 4, right? Because the 4 with the minor 6 is taking the place of the dominant. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're really going to get into the application. That was most of the theory. There's still going to be a little more with theory later in this, but for now I want to get into the practical applications. Because remember, we're learning this to bring it, hopefully, into our music. We're not just here to talk about theoretical stuff. The point of theory is you want it to be able to use it in your music, because it's another color to paint with, and hopefully with that you are affecting people with you want people to be feeling things from what you're doing, not just have it be this cold theoretical concept. And that's the cool thing about negative harmony is it's weird. If we've only been painting up here, I think Steve Coleman called positive the sun energy. Now we're able to paint with the moon energy below, like I was talking about, jumping into the water above and then jumping, swimming up to the surface is the negative below. So these are good things to think about. You want to be thinking about how this feels and how it emotionally connects to music. That's the entire point. So I'm taking a pop song. Now we're in the key of G major. So keep in mind the axis is now G and D. It's not C and G anymore. So we're changing keys. That means we have a new axis. So whereas back here, we were doing the spiral or whatever you want to call it axis over C and G. Now we're doing it over G and D. So here in this key, G would become D, D would become G. So it's the same thing, but it's just in a new key now. So here's what the positive progression sounds like. And I added this little tag at the end. It's not really in this order, but this is something I wanted to address too. Cool. So here's the negative version of it. And I'm being loose with the roots here because you don't have to play the roots yet. It doesn't really, it's not a big deal if you don't. It's just you want to know that the roots are, remember, the fifth and the bass. That's an important thing to know. But once you get that and you chart it out like that, you can ignore the roots like you would normally. You won't have to worry about that until we start dealing with altered notes, which I'll get into in a little bit. But here's the negative version of that. And then here's the tag at the end. It sounds like this. I just realized I played a flat 6 in this, but here it's just a C. So if you really want to get it, you would just play D minor over A. And that would really give you the feel. The flat 6 only reflects this if you have a C major 7 here, so keep that in mind. So that's the first way to do it. The other way to do it, that was me looking at it more compositionally. The other way to think about it is with destinations, right? So rather than have us look at the entire thing in G, we're going to look at where there are key changes. This will allow you to think more practically, like how would you implement, let's say, everyone in the band obviously is not going to be playing negative chord changes. This is more of a compositional tool, but what if they're playing the original changes and you want to play negative harmony over it? Well, there are a few things you can do with that. First of all, if you look at those first two bars, G, so that's the 1 going to the the 1 dominant, secondary dominant going to the C, going to C minor, that's the 4 minor going to G. You can look at these bars up here as negative, but only with, it's like the destination. So G, and rather than we are going to C, so we keep that chord, but instead of the G7, we're going to make it F minor 6, right? So that's how you could implement that over the G7. We're going to keep C minor 6 because that's going back to G. So anytime there's a destination, that's when we're thinking about minor. So we have it going, to the 6th chord here, which is an A minor 6 instead of the B7. The other thing that you could do is you could add, like, let's say you had a 2-5 going to the E minor. So that would sound like... Well, you could also add in a 2-5. Like, anytime you have a chord progression like this, as jazz musicians, we know we can always add a 2-5. Well, you can do the same thing in negative. You can always add a 2-5 negative. So a 2-5 in negative is going to sound like D minor 6, A minor 6, E minor. And if you are confused by that, go back to this chart I had before, remember? So we're in a different key now, but here's the equivalent of the 2 dominant, and here's the equivalent of the dominant. It's the same thing, but we're just in a new key now. So you could solo over that little progression there, and you could go... So you could definitely come up with some interesting lines there. So that's just another thing. Let me go back to this one. I think this is all pretty much self-explanatory, but I'll go through it just in case. So there's our -1. There's our 4, it's our new secondary dominant, right? Going to this chord, going to our, what would that be? That would be the minor 4 or the -4. Going to D7, going back to G, so that's like our -4 minor. So then we have our root again. We have E flat minor 6 going to B flat. Again, that's like the opposite of this. So we have a minor, like a minor, I guess you could call it a minor 6 secondary dominant, or we can't really call it secondary dominant anymore, so I guess we'll call it a secondary minor 6. Secondary minor 6 going to the equivalent of the -6. Then we have this progression here. Okay, so next we're going to do negative all the things you are. I charted it out and wrote the melody in the negative, so I'm going to play along with it just using some basic chords just to give you the idea, and then we'll talk about how it works. Okay, so pretty cool. You can you can hear how it sounds like the exact opposite of all the things you are. So the melody is straightforward. Obviously, you just move in the exact opposite number of interval that the positive one. So if it moves up a half step, you go down a half step. All right, as far as the harmony goes, let's talk about that. So we're starting out with a B6. That's just an F minor 7, reflected around the A flat to E flat axis, right? Now we're in the key of A flat, so we have to reflect around that axis. Okay, then we have G flat. That is our -2 chord, and I put this, remember, double negative sign to indicate that it's G flat 6, but the extensions are dominant. Then we have our -5, which is D flat minor 6, and then we have our -1, A flat minor with a flat 6. Again, technically these are all over a root, but I only put the roots, like, or I'm sorry, it's all over a fifth, like a fifth in the bass, but I put that when it's essential to the progression. Usually the times you're going to find that you need to have one of those in there is like on I think it's on like a negative minor 2/5. That's where it makes a big difference. Other than on negative minor 2/5s, we'll see that in a second. It's not like a big difference that it makes. So after our we left off at -1, which is A flat minor with a flat 6. Then we go to D flat, right? That's our 4 chord, which on here is going to look like E flat minor with a flat 6. Let me just mute this for a second. Right, so there's our -4 chord, E flat minor with a flat 6. Now we have A minor 6 going to E minor flat 6. Okay, there is our key change. And remember, we're going exactly opposite. So if you count how far E minor 6 is away from A flat, right? Like A flat to C is a major third away. It's a major third up because the original change is going to C there. But A flat down to E is a major third down. So it's all moving exact opposite. All right, after that, we have an E6 chord, right? So there is our 3 major. It's a -3, I should say. Going back to our 6 chord, then we're sort of using the 6, or, like we do in All the Things You Are, we make the 6 a 2/5 going to E flat, but instead it's a -2/5, so it's going to D flat minor. And by the way, I know this is confusing stuff. If any of you are looking to get a lesson, I'm definitely free for Skype lessons, so just email me at jackwahmusic@gmail.com and we can work something out. Okay. Then, so we're at the A flat major 7, which is now an A flat minor 6, obviously, because we're making the 1 minor because it's a -1. So here, if you're following along in iRealB, they have a wrong change. I just had to take a second to look at that. It's really A minor. It says on iRealB, it says it's A minor 7, but it's really more like A half diminished. So A half diminished is going to translate to an E over D chord. It's also, if you just look at the triad, it's a diminished chord, but if you add on the 7, if you add on the 7, it ends up being an E over D chord. So I put the negative there. It doesn't really matter, but I just reminding you, if you were to do any extensions, you'd have to be following the scale notes and not, the positive version of E over D. But really, you're mostly going to be playing this pretty dry, I think. We're already adding enough colors. I will go over later, though, how you do a minor 2/5 in the negative properly. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so that's going to the -5 of G. And you can check yourself too when you're doing this because, right, -5 going to A minor, which is the equivalent of G in the positive, right? So they're both a half step away from the root. So that's how you can check yourself. Okay, so now I want to talk about altered just a little, because right here, it doesn't say it in iRealB, but there's an E7 sharp 11 chord that goes to the A minor, right? So, that part of the melody that goes. All right, so let's talk about how altered works in this. We're just going to talk about a little. I'm going to give you a primer because this is going to initially like kind of be a little mind blowing, and it's going to be a lot to take in because we're already dealing with a lot. But remember how earlier I told you that, right? So our altered chord here is it's a C minor 6 over G altered, right? Which is the equivalent of the positive E7. Now, how do we do altered in the negative? So, you know how I told you that the 5 is functioning like the 1? So that means the 1 is functioning like the 5. Well, in the positive, when we have an altered chord, the 5 is the note that gets altered, right? So it's a sharp 5 or a sharp 4 or a flat 5, whatever you want to call it. But in the negative, if our 5 is functioning like the 1, well, we can't alter that. So we'd have to alter the 1. So the C is going to become, you're gonna leave out the C, and instead of like, picture how you'd voice an altered chord, you would normally leave out the 5, and you'd make, if you were gonna include a 5, it would either be a flat 5 or a sharp 5. But in negative altered, because the 5 functions like the 1 and the 1 functions like the 5, you are going to be leaving out the 1, and you're going to be doing a flat 1 or a natural 7. So this is pretty cool because now we have just figured out how we can access a note that was otherwise inaccessible to us, which is a flat 1 over a C minor 6 chord. I guess that was accessible in certain things, but if you look at the rest of the extensions, you have a flat 1 and you have a natural 3 and you have a natural... I mean, these are bizarre notes to be playing over a C minor 6 chord, and we're making notes sound accessible that wouldn't otherwise be accessible to us. I'll get back to this later because later in the lesson I have something on extensions. So I'll get to, or excuse me, I have something on the altered scale. So I'll go over that more later. So then we have pretty straightforward, a 2-5 going to A minor. Then we have, okay, G over F, which is the equivalent of F sharp, half diminished and positive. F minor 6 over C going to C minor, right? That's that C minor is going to look like E in the positive. And then we have E minor 6 going to B6, and that brings us back to the main section of the melody. So we're in positive, we're back to F minor 7. So we follow that same first 4 bars, and then we are at E flat minor, flat 6. That's going to take us to the D flat major 7 in the positive. Then we have our negative dominant 4 chord. Right, so if you look at the D flat minor, that's, what chord is that? D flat minor natural 7, or D flat, it's a D flat melodic minor scale. You can think of that as a minor 4. So we're doing the opposite here. Instead, we're going to have a dominant 7 for a 4. Then we go to the E6 chord. That's going to be like our C minor 7, so that's, the negative 3 chord. F diminished, same thing as B diminished in the positive. Then a 2-5 going back to 1. That's pretty much everything for all the things you are. Again, you'd want to note that for this, you wouldn't be able to play all of this over the original. This is a compositional technique more than anything, but you want to understand it this way so you can go back and just interject it here and there like we did up here only with destinations. However, on a song like Giant Steps, where the intervals are all symmetrical, like Giant Steps is built in major thirds, you technically could play negative. It's already pretty fast, and you could play negative and get some pretty wild sounds over it. So negative Giant Steps sounds a little like this. So pretty cool. You can hear how it moves opposite, contrary to actual giant steps. The idea here is I wanted to just include a brief part, to see how it would sound on, a more advanced jazz song. And we can see it's still B, E flat, G. It's still that same triad, but now they're minor. And now we have the -5 chords moving to them. And it gets really interesting once you start soloing on giant steps in the negative when it's actually playing in the positive, or vice versa. If you were going to make like a negative giant steps, you could probably solo in the positive. There's a lot of combinations. The reason though that giant steps works particularly well for doing that is because of the symmetrical movement of the entire song. It's based on the augmented triad. So if you were going to do that drastic sound, it would probably work better on something like this. So now we're going to get into the practical approaches of negative harmony. So I'm going to take a 3-6-2-5 in C. All right, so we're going back to that chart I showed you earlier. I think I have it here. Yeah, so 3-6-2-5. We're going to play all these chords. So what you could do is you could solo while the harmony is going. I'm going to do this really slow, but you could go. Right, so I just soloed over A flat minor 6, E flat minor 6, B flat minor 6, F minor 6 going to C, but I did it over a positive chord progression. So there's a lot of combinations involving that. You could mix it up, and you could be playing E7 for 1 second, then you could solo in E flat minor 6 the next second, B flat minor 6 over this chord, and then you could go back to the positive. So you have a lot of different combinations between playing chords and playing and actually soloing in the negative. The key, I think, is to keep the destination in mind. You're not going to be able to. Chances are it's going to be hard to solo over an entire song that's already in the positive, like in the negative. But for practical approaches when soloing in a jazz context, I think it's really, really useful when you keep in mind the destination and you make these little journeys happen like that. Okay, another practical approach. This is getting into the last theory thing we'll go over, is the altered scale. So I mentioned that earlier when we were dealing with all the things you are. So here's the positive altered scale, right? G altered, positive altered lick I have too. We'll go over that in a second. So G altered is the A flat melodic minor scale. Now when we flip that, we're back in C by the way. When we flip that around that C to G axis, we get this. It's really interesting. We get 5, we get sharp 4, we get natural 3, we get flat 3, we get sharp 1, natural 7, and 6. So remember how I said that in a G7 altered, you'd leave the D out of this voicing. You wouldn't play a D in a G7 altered. You leave it out. But because when we are in the negative, the D is now, or the 5 is now the 1 of this. So our 1 is what's being left out of the voicing. You can see that right here. We're either going to do a sharp 1 or we're going to do a natural 7. If you really want to get into colors, you can see the parallel. Sharp 1 is acting like the sharp 4, sharp 5 like the natural 7. Anyway, that's the idea here. And it has a really cool sound. It's a melodic minor, but it has a very, very interesting sound over the F minor 6. And another thing, if you were going to see this on a chord chart, what you would do is you'd make sure you include the bass note, and you would leave out the root, and then just change the root to either a sharp 1 or a natural 7. Just like you would on positive altered, except you change the 5th to a sharp 4 or a sharp 5. So I just took a lick as an example, a really common, I'm making most of the licks here very simple, just for learning purposes, so you can take it and run with it. But right, that's the lick. So I'll play it one more time. Okay, so here's where it gets cool. If we're gonna take that same lick and do it in altered, so I'll do that one more time. I'll sing it over the chord. Pretty cool. So it does have that opposite sound. It's like a brightening sound, right? So we're resolving from beneath and we're coming up. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to look at was a minor 2-5 or a negative minor 2-5 with a melodic minor inflection, right? So here's a minor 2-5 going to A minor, right? We're in the key of C. Our axis, keep in mind, is C to G. So it's common to add a melodic minor inflection on the 2. We would add a natural 9 and then an altered on the 5. Here's what that translates to in negative. You can see below. So let's just take our B half diminished. Let's even just take the triad first and go over that again, right? So we're flipping B DF around the axis and we get DF over A flat. So D diminished over A flat. Then when we flip A, the 7 of the half diminished in the positive over the axis, we get B flat. That's B flat over A flat. Now when we flip C sharp over the axis, we get G flat. Okay, so that leaves us with B flat, flat 6 over A flat. Now we do the same thing with the E altered scale, that's F melodic minor. Flip it over the axis of C to G, we wind up with C melodic minor. So we get a negative 5 chord with an altered flare. Keep in mind, like we said before, if we're dealing with altered, the 1 is either going to be, it's going to be left out. So we're not going to play an A flat in this. We're going to be playing a sharp 1, so an A natural, or a natural 7. So that'd be a G. I didn't do it in this voicing, but that's just good to keep in mind for when you're using this. And then it resolves to an E flat 6 over B flat. Okay, so here's how it sounds back to back. Here's the positive, and then I'll play the negative. Awesome. The last thing to note is if you take out this natural 9 here and this flat 6 here, so let's pretend it's just a B half diminished going to E7, going to A minor. We'll forget about like the altered and the melodic minor. And here's, we'll say it's B flat over A flat, going to A flat minor 6, going to E flat, right? So normally on this, we would think harmonic minor, So that means if you take the inverse of harmonic minor, we actually end up, or the negative of harmonic minor, we end up with harmonic major. So over this chord progression, which sounds kind of like this, we would play harmonic major, E flat harmonic major. So that's kind of a cool scale to mess around with. And that's pretty much everything I have right now on the negative. Hope you guys enjoyed the lesson. I have a little more that I'll be coming out with soon. Jack Gruber figured out some really, really awesome bebop applications for negative. So stick around for that. I'll come out with that pretty soon, and I'll do a thing with him where we talk about that a little. But yeah, I know it's a dense subject matter. If you have more questions, feel free to email me at jackwahmusic@gmail.com. Cool.